we may well end up with a True North community, a True North movement that ends up with a life of its own. And wouldn't that be fantastic in terms of, Brabners contributing to that happening, but then all us as individual leaders contributing to that happening as well. So we're open-minded, really.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way.
In a recent episode of The Purposeful Strategist, I spoke with Nick White, managing partner of Brabners, a leading independent UK law firm with national reach and offices in Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Lancashire. Nick shared valuable insights into how the firm's purpose and values have shaped its culture and growth. He also mentioned True North, a collaborative network created by Brabners in 2023. I wanted to know more about that, and Nick suggested I hear directly from the person who started it, his colleague Robert White, the CEO of Brabners. Robert has been at the helm of Brabners since 2017, steering the firm's strategic direction and helping it grow into a powerhouse in the legal industry. However, in this episode, instead of Brabners, we're going to focus on True North. Under Robert's guidance, the network has grown quickly to over 350 members who are dedicated to unlocking the potential of the northern economy. Robert, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thanks, Belden. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, really great to have you. Just to start with some of the basics, can you share what True North is all about and what it aims to do?
Yeah, so True North is recognizing that the chasm between northern productivity and northern prosperity is a fundamental challenge that business faces. And the objective really is to bring together the purpose-led business community, of which we as Brabners see ourselves a key part of, and really create the environment for that business community to play its part in addressing, hopefully, that chasm in productivity and prosperity from a perspective of firstly recognizing it exists, but then secondly, through collaboration, unlocking opportunities and creating a community and a platform for the purpose-led business community to play its part.
For clarity, and particularly maybe for some people who aren't in the UK, part of that chasm, if I understand it right, is sort of between London and the southeast and its level of productivity and a whole bunch of other things, and the north.
Yeah, so for example, if you exclude London and the southeast from our productivity as a country, then the richest or most prosperous part of the UK is poorer than Mississippi, for example, which is the poorest state in the US. So the question really is, how can that be? And then if you look at the north as a whole, of the 62 regional authorities that make up the north of England, only 11 of them have above average productivity compared to the country as a whole. So it's recognizing firstly that exists, but also recognizing that the way that the country has sought to address that over generations hasn't worked. And therefore, how can the purpose-led business community play its part in addressing that? Because it cannot be allowed to continue. But the important thing is that that's from a positive and productive perspective rather than the other option, which would be, to talk about that negatively. And clearly it's not great, but in order to address it, we have to address it through positive action, grassroots action, practical solutions, moving beyond short-term political cycles, because this is a generation issue, working in collaboration as businesses, but also with local authorities, because that's part of the solution. And I guess the cultural aspect of it is that I think it is true to say that as a region in the past, for example, there was a perception that if Liverpool won, Manchester lost. If Manchester won, then Leeds lost. And I think there is a fantastic opportunity, largely on the back of devolution, to move beyond that, I think there is a recognition that that has held us back. And you can look at places in the United States, for example, where regional clustered specialisms that recognize particular specialisms that collaborate rather than compete, particularly on a global scale, is the way to address that productivity and thereby the prosperity challenge.
The problem, if I could call it that, it's been there for a long time. What kind of was the spark that led True North to be created? Why did it make sense for Brabners to do that?
There's a number of reasons for that. If I speak about Brabners as a business that happens to be a law firm, firstly, we do see ourselves as part of the purpose-led business community. We have a strong sense that it is our responsibility as a purpose-led business to play our part in addressing that. And we believe that the business community gets it and is perhaps even best placed to address it. Business has a good track record of making things happen. I guess the question around why Brabners as maybe a law firm that happens to be a business, it is part of our business, given that we are a professional services law firm. Our business takes us into so many different types of businesses and relationships that we do feel that we are perhaps better placed than some as a professional services firm to convene this network and be the catalyst to it. In terms of the catalyst for True North itself, I think there is a generational shift in that this cannot be allowed to continue and we have to address it now. That has coincided with a greater movement or momentum towards devolution, which is part of the answer. For example, Manchester is perhaps further along the devolution curve than other parts. The Manchester Combined Authority is collaborating perhaps more than ever with the Liverpool Regional Combined Authority. And similarly, if you look on the other side of the Pennines, on the east side into Yorkshire, similarly, that combined authority coming together with greater devolved power and a recognition around these clustered specialisms. So there does feel like, now is the time, and we're really keen as a network and as a business that we make sure that business plays its part, because I would argue, and some may choose to agree or disagree, if business is not part of the solution and the environment is not created for business to play its part, then the chances of ultimately addressing the productivity challenge, the prosperity challenge, and making it inclusive across the region as a whole is far less without business's involvement.
You've talked a couple of times about clustered specialisms. I suspect there's many, but if you could just point to one or two so that is a little less of an abstract idea and sort of I can see here are the kinds of people who would be coming together and doing something.
Yes, you're right, Belden. There are many. And, if you think about that in the context perhaps of the larger cities, there are health and biosciences in Merseyside, advanced manufacturing in the Liverpool City region. In Manchester, technology, bioscience, cybersecurity, Leeds and Yorkshire, advanced manufacturing. And then there is the kind of the cyber security corridor that runs out of Manchester into Lancashire and actually goes as far as Northern Ireland. You can start to see these things coming together. And I guess the central argument is that if you take the individual parts of the North, particularly in a global world, they have lesser chance in addressing these challenges by operating alone. And that, if you look to the United States and into Europe, particularly Germany, there are many, many examples of, if regions compete, then they are less successful than regions that collaborate. The advanced manufacturing aspect of it is one that I always kind of point to as the example. So we have the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, AMRC, in Sheffield. We have it in Lancashire, aligned with the defence and security industry and aerospace. And then in Broughton, in kind of Merseyside area, we have another advanced manufacturing research centre. And those three parts are part of the same organisation that collaborates across the region as a whole.
What types of businesses and leaders are joining, and what do you think sort of draws them to True North?
Again, that's a really interesting question, and it's businesses, business leaders, and other organisations of all shapes and sizes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really careful about how I articulate this, because I recognize by addressing this that it cannot be pointing the finger at other areas of the country and other types of businesses, but it is widely acknowledged that post 2016 big business investment certainly plateaued in the UK. And I guess the mood music around that time was that, frankly, the world was going to cave in. And the truth is, it's not been great, but equally, it hasn't caved in. So why is that? And we started to explore that when True North was being born. And it does really lead to the perspective that privately owned, owner-managed businesses in particular are those that are genuinely the engine room of the economy. And we had a sense, again, not bashing anything that has gone before, that many of these businesses, having done a series of roundtables, felt like they were not listened to. They felt unheard and felt like they didn't have a voice. And that's really where True North came in that we felt that it was our responsibility to convene it, but equally it provides the opportunity for those businesses to have a voice. And just to expand on that, everything we do as True North is about practical solutions and being data-led. So we engaged with a partner out of Leeds called Open Innovation to really try to get to the data that could either confirm or deny what we felt intuitively. And what we've been able to prove, for example, is that of those kind of privately owned, owner-managed businesses, which is a really broad definition, there are broadly 400,000 of those in the north of England, and they are growing at a rate of around about 8.5% a year. So that gives us the comfort that actually what we were feeling and seeing intuitively has some merit, and that does seem to have resonated. And that's why I think those organisations are engaging with True North. And the key objective for 2025 is really to build that true sense of community within the network, but also beyond it, so that we can, as a network, play our part in, I guess, purpose-led businesses driving that productivity and ultimately the prosperity that follows.
You and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, and when we spoke then, you mentioned Northern Stars, smaller businesses, social enterprises, foundations that very much, as you were saying now, may not have a voice. And you've also talked about sort of practical solutions. So practically, what kind of support or opportunities does True North provide to those sorts of organizations?
The Northern Stars concept came from perhaps post deindustrialization of the North, a lazy stereotype about what northern businesses are. So Northern Stars was really about creating or shining a light, highlighting these really great businesses that are doing great things that largely you never hear about. So it was almost a counterbalance to that lazy stereotype, shining a light on the fact that these businesses are great businesses doing great things. There's an advantage to those businesses in being highlighted and spotlighted, but it's really about ultimately what we're trying to create is this sense of community and hopefully a movement, right? And the movement is that we create the environment for these purpose-led businesses to feel like they are heard, they are listened to, and that hopefully opens up collaborative opportunities outside the network, but then also inside the network. Simply by having that sense of community, we're already seeing businesses that are connecting at True North events that then go on to explore opportunities between them. So that idea of convening is, I guess, it's one of the key parts of True North.
If I understand right, you've conducted some independent research. So why did you do that? What was the idea behind the research, and what were the biggest takeaways from it?
I guess the research was a series of roundtables. Yes, that was facilitated by the partner that we're using to help us with the campaign. The themes that came out of that around the opportunities for businesses and sometimes challenges around people skills in the future, sustainable growth, innovation and change, and purpose and social impact. Those were the themes that came out of those roundtable exercises. The partnership that we then launched with Open Innovation was partly to validate that through data, but then also to answer questions that we may well have around, well, what are the types of things that we think businesses need to be exploring? Can we validate that by data so that we can start to illustrate practical solutions? Just to build on that for a minute, one of the really interesting things is this idea of agglomeration, and ultimately by investing in cities, that's the thing that sparks it. You can already start to see that happening, particularly in Greater Manchester, for example, where obviously starting in Manchester itself, it's now starting to permeate out into Trafford, which are all kind of separate areas around Manchester: Trafford, Salford, Oldham, and Stockport. Alongside devolution, really, a key aspect of success is going to come from regeneration, and True North supporting the regeneration projects. And we can already see through the data, if you take Oldham, for example, which has recently had been part of a regeneration project, you can start to see that growth is now starting to come. So the number of business births in Oldham is amongst the highest, if not the highest, in the north of England. So we can really start to see the positive impact, but also, I guess, the areas that are being left behind, and use that data to validate everything and to demonstrate positive impact.
How have you shared the results of that research? I assume you shared it with the network, but more broadly than that, how might you? And what's the reaction been?
So far, we've done 2 reports. The first report was defining Northern Ambition, defining what it is. The second report that was launched at the end of January was called Scaling Northern Ambition, which was really, okay, having defined it, how do you now scale it? So we engaged with the network and our Northern Stars to get their perspective on how you scale it. So Scaling Northern Ambition is almost a practical guide from that interaction and engagement. We have a series of events running in 2025 that will continue to build both the engagement with the network and beyond, but also helps to form our learning and our direction. We do a number of kind of speaking opportunities to continue to engage with, I'm tempted to say anybody that will listen, but principally the business community, various elements of the public sector, to try and foster that collaboration. We're doing it on all fronts to kind of keep the momentum building so that we do hopefully create this movement of purpose-led businesses playing their part.
And who sets the strategy for True North? How's that been developed so far? And do you think that's going to change?
Yeah, so we have an advisory council of which I co-chair with some partners of ours. I mentioned the 4 pillars of our work. And we've identified on the advisory council 2 people that they kind of focus on those pillars first and foremost, but then we come together as an advisory council of 11 people to set the strategy. And we learnt a lot throughout the course of 2024. We have already, I guess, adapted our approach in that one of the things we found, for example, was that we were onto something with those 4 pillars, but equally, the 4 of them work together so closely that it's quite difficult to separate them because the left hand influences the right hand. So the advisory council has become much more the general custodian of True North rather than those particular areas. But there's one, I guess, golden thread that we've learnt, which is that really success has to come through aligning the appropriate skills with the business need. And that flows through everything, whether it's innovation and change, sustainable growth, or purpose and social impact. So people skills in the future, I guess, is the one that is going to take the majority of our focus, because without that, you can't deliver the others.
How's True North supported and sustained? Is it Brabners? Is it sort of it's all voluntary? How does all that work?
It is a Brabners initiative, and there are a number of, I guess, business reasons from Brabner's perspective as to why doing something like True North is perfectly aligned in that, our purpose is to demonstrate that business can bring about positive and lasting change for our clients, our people, and the communities we serve. So True North ticks that box. We recognize that being a brand-led firm is going to project us forward, but also insulate us from some of the structural changes that are happening in the market, and True North helps us along that way. So in that sense, Brabners writes the check. Everything else is voluntary. And I guess I ultimately, as chief exec of Brabners and co-chair of True North, I'm keen that we maintain that degree of independence between the two. We may well end up with a True North community, a True North movement that ends up with a life of its own. And wouldn't that be fantastic in terms of, Brabners contributing to that happening, but then all us as individual leaders contributing to that happening as well. So we're open-minded really about where it may end up.
I think you've described True North as a sort of open invitation group. What does that mean in practice? And if someone listening to this thought, I personally would like to be part of that, or I think my organization ought to be part of that, how does that work? What can they expect as a process?
Well, it most certainly is an open invitation. It's as simple as going onto our True North webpage, filling out a form, and becoming part of the membership. As simple as that. I guess they can expect and what we hope to create, because we have to answer the what's in it for us question. And that's really where that sense of community comes in. As business leaders, there are times when it's lonely. There are times when there are frustrations associated with what we do, or potentially missed opportunities, and we don't feel that we necessarily can grasp those opportunities. And that's really where we're trying to build this sense of community. One of the first roundtable sessions we went to was in Sheffield in South Yorkshire, where we as a firm don't have an office at this point. So we hadn't really engaged with the kind of local Sheffield market other than being a northern firm. And one of the themes that came out of it was that Sheffield has a reputation from the past, but there was this real sense of an entrepreneurship movement or vibe happening in the city at that point. But because of, I guess, the characteristics of the past, that hadn't necessarily been matched, particularly by access to finance. And there was almost this theme around, well, we've got these great entrepreneurial businesses, we want to scale. Where do we go to connect with potential funders that can help us scale? And I guess that was one of the things that validated why True North hopefully can work, in that, we'll naturally have businesses, organizations whose business model is to fund entrepreneurship. And hopefully we can, put those two things together. So convening and connecting, I guess, are two principles that we see as being real value in the network.
Taking what might be a little side divergence just for a second, one of the things that's happened in the US in the last 20, 30 years in the world of sort of startups and technology and everything is much more focused investors who, we're investing in startups in Pittsburgh, we're investing in startups in Detroit. Are you seeing signs of that developing, or maybe it's already out there and I've just not noticed it?
Yes, definitely. I guess it is anecdotal, certainly from my perspective, is that there does appear to be much more specialist investment opportunities out there. And I guess we've seen that perhaps coincide with the CSR, ESG type movement as well, in that purposeful, socially impactful businesses seeking investment, that investment being available, is certainly something that we are seeing.
Changing sort of the focus a little bit from True North itself, actually, to you a little bit, and just thinking about your experience leading True North, what's been the most surprising or rewarding aspects of it, and how's that fit in with your other role as the CEO of a large business that happens to be a law firm?
Yeah. I think the most rewarding aspect of it, and it may sound strange, was that people and businesses were and are willing to engage. We now have 408 organizations within the network. And that, to me, is the most rewarding thing, in that there are 408 busy businesses, business leaders, and other organizations that have taken the time to engage with us. That's almost like the kind of quantitative measure of success. The qualitative measure is that whenever we come together as a network, as we did at the end of January, facilitated by Brabners, the atmosphere in the room, the level of engagement, the enthusiasm about, really stepping into this generational challenge has frankly blown me away. I find that nourishing, exciting, but equally it's quite daunting, because this is a generational challenge. It's not like we're going to have or find all the answers. All we can do is play our part. So it's been hugely rewarding. And it is true to say that if True North was completely misaligned with my responsibilities as Brabner's chief exec, then I wouldn't do it. But the reality is that they are very, very much aligned.
Yeah. And what advice would you give to other leaders who might be thinking of creating something similar to True North as a way to expand their own organization's impact?
I guess I would say just take that leap of faith. This is not about pointing the finger at anybody, because the reality is we all have a part to play. There's no one business, no one organization, government, or any authority that can solve this problem or grasp this opportunity on its own. So, it has to be about collaboration. So I would say take the leap of faith, and then I guess find like-minded organizations, businesses, and business leaders to work and collaborate with.
Anything we haven't covered that you'd like listeners to know about True North?
I think ultimately it has to be about practical solutions. So one of the things that we challenge ourselves to do is, okay, we at some point we have to demonstrate that as a community of purpose-led businesses that have come together as part of True North, that we can deliver practical solutions. So we're trying to find opportunities to do that would then validate some of the central pillars of the movement. So one of the things that we are exploring for 2025 is where can we bring the network to a specific set of circumstances in the north of England where we can demonstrate that when business comes together as True North, it has positive outcomes.
So I think it's really very positive to try and stay focused on what can work, what will work, what is working, rather than whose fault is it, all that, which isn't really helpful. I think that's incredibly positive. Sort of not looking to someone else to come bail you out, to figure out your problems, but to say, okay, here we are. What can we do?
That is dead right. And look, you may agree or disagree with this, is that decision making in the UK in particular is too centralized. And on the one hand, you could look at that and say, that's the reason, that's somebody else's fault, and focus on that. But then equally, as a community of the North, we've allowed that to happen. So, we have to grasp the opportunity. And I think that's why devolution in particular is almost one of the catalysts, because that creates the environment for the northern community, of which the business community is part, to grasp the opportunity to be more responsible for its own destiny. It's proven that if you invest in infrastructure, transport, housing, energy, then productivity improves. It tends to start in the major cities and then permeate outwards. And it's proven, globally that that's the way to go about it. For some reason, as a country, we have allowed that situation to exacerbate with, London being London, which is fantastic. And actually, one of the things that we always say is, as much as we are really supportive of Manchester and the whole of the North, is that we need to guard against Manchester becoming the London of the North. And that's really where the collaborative clusters comes in, because everybody has to benefit from that investment.
The two historical parallels that come to my mind is, and I'm sure many people could object to this, but nevertheless, the Hanseatic League, a group of cities that were connected by water and at times, no doubt, competed, but primarily collaborated and worked together. And then equally, the sort of center of the Renaissance in northern Italy, a whole bunch of cities that had their own identity and their own legacy and their own history and to some extent their own culture. And yet somehow the combination of them together created something really magical.
Yeah. I guess therein lies the opportunity, doesn't it, Belden? And as I say, I do think there has been a monumental shift in perspective around what success looks like. And, that perhaps old-fashioned view of, if one part of the North wins, another one loses. And I do think genuinely we are well beyond that perspective. And hopefully devolution with more decentralized decision making and, the investment that inevitably has to follow, all those things coming together is a fantastic opportunity, and one that we cannot afford to miss. And that's really where True North sits, in that, we as a business community, particularly a purpose-led business community, we're ready, willing and able to play our part in moving that forward.
That's probably a good sort of note to end on. Let me thank you again for coming and sharing where you're going with True North. I think it's a fantastic model for what's possible and what leaders can do that sort of take their ambition, their intention, their purpose, well beyond their walls and create something that wouldn't exist otherwise. So thank you for sharing it.
No, thank you, Belden. I'm delighted to do so, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.